58th public lecture series of the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus. Turning from excavation to landscape archaeology and surface survey, and from the Bronze to the Iron Age, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce our today's speaker, Professor Vladimir Stissi, who holds the chair of classical archaeology at the Amsterdam Center of Ancient Studies and Archaeology of the University of Amsterdam since 2005. Vladimir Stissi defended his PhD in 2002 at the University of Amsterdam. He worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the same institution in 2000 to 2003 and as assistant professor until 2005. Professor Stissi's research focuses on various aspects of the production, distribution, uses, and meanings of Greek pottery from the early Iron Age into the Hellenistic period, and on field methods and find processing. He has participated in numerous field projects since 1991, working as pottery specialist in the framework of excavations and survey projects in Albania, Greece, and Italy. Amongst those, the Ancient Cities of Boeotia project, directed by John Pintley and Anthony Snodgrass, in the framework of which I have been also collaborating with him since 2000, the survey project at Ancient Halos and its territory, directed by Reinder Reinders and the Effort of Antiquities, as well as the Zakynthos archaeological project, directed by Gert-Jan van Wijngaarden, and the Keros Katokofonisi and Southern Naxos project, directed by Colin Renfrew. He has also been director of the Halos Survey project of the Amsterdam Archaeologisch Centrum since 2011. Vladimir is also an architectural historian and chairman of the Kuipers Society since 2000. Classical heritage and how the classical visual culture has been incorporated in art and architecture from the 19th and 20th centuries is another of his research interests. He has been a member of several council and editorial boards since 1999, such as the Allard Pearson Museum in Amsterdam, the Netherlands Institute at Athens, the UNESCO Netherlands National Commission, the Netherlands Royal Academy of Sciences, and others. He has published more than 80 journal articles, book chapters, and conference proceedings on survey ceramic assemblages, pottery and food preparation, survey archaeology, the early polis and settlement evolution, Athenian ceramic production, and the appreciation of Athenian figured pottery, combining art historical and social historical approaches. Closing this introduction, I would like to kindly ask our participants to switch off their cameras and mute their microphones. Should you wish to address a question or comment to our speaker, feel free to use the chat button on Zoom. You may also switch on your cameras after the end of the presentation to address a question directly to the speaker by raising your hand and unmuting your microphone. Professor Stissi, dear Vladimir, we very much look forward to hearing about how survey assemblages may contribute to our understanding of the polis, using Halos as a case study example. My colleague, George Papasavas, and I will coordinate the discussion session following your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Thanasis. Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for your invitation. I feel honored to be in your lecture series. I hope to be in Cyprus itself, but this is a good way of reaching a very international audience, I saw. So I hope I can bring some fun out of the shirts I will show and other things. For those who don't know yet, I have to see how I go to the next slide. Yeah. For those who don't know yet, ancient Halos is a small city-state, although that's something open to some discussion, as we will see later on, which is almost exactly in the center of modern Greece, in what is now Magnesia, a part of Thessaly. And the place may mainly be known in an archaeological context from the excavations by the FR8 and the Groningen University of the Hellenistic city, which seems to have formed the polis center for about a generation in the early 3rd century BCE, and where field work has taken place since the 1970s up to the early 2000s, with the houses and city walls and a city gate being investigated. But besides the excavation work, already since the 1990s, areas around the Hellenistic city have been surveyed. Initially, this started as a project to contextualize the Hellenistic city and explore its surroundings. But slowly it got a life of its own, and it started to cover a much larger area. And there's a whole series of fieldwork seasons, 6 seasons directed by Reiner Reinders and the University of Groningen, which form still the basis of all later work. And then a series of seasons from 2011 onwards, directed by the University of Amsterdam, which were mainly revisits and checks of the earlier result. Partly because the survey in the 1990s and early 2000s was a semi-systematic and quite intuitive project. It was not the kind of survey which is very well known nowadays, where you walk in exact squares or the complete areas are covered based on GPS and satellite data and so on. It was far more simple, based on paper maps and field walking in strips, which did not cover the whole area. This was partly simply for practical reasons in terms of time management and the size of the teams, but it was partly also based on existing knowledge of the area, where, let's say, initial exploration simply by walking alone by Professor Reinders showed that there are large areas in the survey terrain which don't show archaeological finds for geomorphological reasons or historical reasons. So it was already established early on that by far most of the archaeological sites are on high ridges, so-called finger ridges in the landscape, and the lower areas have much less. They're not entirely free of sites, but they were so few that it wasn't considered to be worthwhile surveying it very systematically, although tests have been done. And also in the 2011 and 2015 tests by the University of Amsterdam, we have tested this again, and it proved to be correct that the density of sites is partly a function of the landscape as it is now. Another aspect which makes this project different from many more recent surveys is that it was very strongly site-based. So even though much of the landscape was walked, registration and collecting material was very much focused on concentrations. So if walkers in the field would encounter concentration of finds, this was then defined and material was collected. And there again, another difference with many present projects is that collection was not completely systematic nor complete. So the focus was very strongly on diagnostic material, and a large proportion of the finds was also only counted, or not even that, and thrown away either in the field or back in the deposit without very much registration, which means that the number of finds can be quite random. And this has been confirmed also by the revisits, where we did work a bit more systematically, that what is in the collections now is not always a very good quantitative representation of what is on the ground. Although the revisit did show that qualitatively the problems are much less. So impressionistic recording and collection has caused and still causes complications when you want to interpret the results, but they don't seem to have resulted in very substantial biases, obviously depending also on the research questions. If you want to do very detailed research, this material doesn't work. Against these drawbacks, one nice aspect of this project has been that from the beginning, many sites have been revisited. So we do have find collections over the years from the same place, and also a recording of the state of sites. So we can see how sites develop in time. And perhaps surprisingly, the general result seems to be that things don't change very much. There are sites appearing and disappearing, but the bulk of the sites seems to be quite stable from an archaeological point of view. Obviously, there are things like road building and agricultural digging and so on, which do disturb sites, but the sites which are in normal plowland don't seem to change very much. But yeah, we do have a big bulk of legacy data, and at the moment we are trying to integrate the more recent Amsterdam finds and results with the earlier Groningen University ones, and start preparing a publication and an interpretation of the material. And what I will show today is about that. And the basis of my paper and of everything we work with are the old survey data, the 1990s, early 2000s. These projects, these seasons recorded about 250 sites in an area west and southeast of the Hellenistic city, which is at the red triangle. I don't know where you can see my mouse, but more or less at the junction of the two arms of black dots. And these 250 recorded sites yielded about 10,000 kept finds, which are not evenly distributed among sites, must be stressed. And yeah, about 80% of the sites have less than 25 kept finds. And collections like this one, a site surveyed in 2000, are quite typical. And the big issue today basically is, are collections like this one possible sources for an interpretation which goes beyond dating or attributing single sherds or group of sherds? Can these, to be honest, quite meager collections help us understanding the landscape, not only in terms of practical dots on maps, but also in terms of more social or political structures? That's the big question. And maybe in saying so, one of the goals of the revisits was to enrich the collections. But one of the conclusions we came to quite soon in doing the revisits is actually that, as I said before, in many ways, these meager looking collections are quite representative of what is on the ground, and collecting more material in many cases simply seems to offer more of the same, unless of course you are going to a much more intensive collection method where you would collect all material from many of the sites, but we didn't spend so much energy on doing that. This seems to be about so our revisits very often simply produced more of the same of what we already had. In a few cases, even sherds which fitted the material already collected 10 or 15 years before even. So that's a few things to keep in mind. And well, as you already saw in the previous slide, and this is a slide showing results on the ground directly when collected during the revisits, much of the material is in a quite bad state and barely diagnostic. Lots of tile, lots of very worn body sherds. Some of these can actually be dated or interpreted based on fabrics, but much of it is really very generic, and we have found out that some pottery fabrics in this area have been in use from antiquity into the 20th century. So then a worn body shirt doesn't tell us very much. That is one of the reasons why these old collections are actually not that bad, because all is relative. So chronology remains an issue. We have to base ourselves very strongly on diagnostic material, which may not be completely representative. And even the more diagnostic material is often, and that's of course not a strange thing in survey, is often diagnostic to a certain extent. It can be roughly dated, it can be roughly placed in a functional category, but usually not very precisely. And yeah, that's a typical survey problem, which may be a bit more severe in this area than in some others. But it is something also to take into account when doing interpretations. What we did manage to do or try to do is count site numbers by period and also map them. And the simple graph is that the Surpi area, which is the area southeast of the city of Halos, and the Amiros Plains area, which is the area west of the city, offer more or less the same in chronological terms. The main difference is the early Iron Age bar, but that's the result of the fact that the Amiros Plains area includes a large early Iron Age burial ground, and that was especially targeted in the 1990 survey. So that skews data a bit. If you take that out, the image seems to show a fairly uniform pattern over the two areas. And it also suggests a fairly stable number of sites over time. Of course, that's a bit tricky because the periods shown are not all the same length. And especially the prehistoric period obviously is many, many, many times longer than all the others. But yeah, from the early Iron Age, or actually no, from the Archaic period onwards, it seems that numbers of sites are fairly stable over time. This, of course, is even leaving aside the time duration of periods. This also doesn't take into account site size and things like that. Partly because it's very difficult to establish that, and partly because we simply didn't do it yet. So the problem now is we have these counts, and we can analyze the pottery, give dates, give shapes, and things like that. But what we want with that is to understand the area, which is something you always want in survey archaeology and landscape archaeology, I suppose. But one thing which makes this area interesting is that we have quite some historical information about the political organization of the area, suggesting it's an interesting area a bit in between what we see further south, let's say the classical city-state Greece, and further north, which is considered to be the areas with tribal organization, kingdoms, the ethnos. And well, Thessaly obviously traditionally is always placed a bit, it is placed in that category mainly, even though it's clear there are big cities. And even though many of the places, the large squares in this map, in inscriptions and sometimes also in historical text, are presented as polis, so as city-states. And well, that leaves us with the question, obviously what they pretend to be doesn't have to be what they are. And if they say they are something, what does that mean in practice? Questions about social organization in relation to settlement of the landscape, because that's another important aspect. We know that in many city-states in Greece, the central place is very dominant in terms of the population size and also in terms of power. And one question you could ask in an area like this, which well, is not traditionally seen as an area strong in the city-state formation, how does that work? We do have the Hellenistic city, which is a 50-hectare fortified city, which is a classical city-state core. However, this only existed for about 30 years. So that's a blip in a long-term perspective. And what about earlier and later periods? And there we hope that survey and a better understanding of the wider landscape may help us understanding. And that's what the talk today is mostly about, besides simply showing some of the survey results. One interesting feature, not only of this survey, but which seemed to be quite notable when I went through, with my colleagues, went through the pottery, just as I have done also in other areas, is that there's a rather strong quantity, relatively, of multi-period sites which have material, even though the collections sometimes are very small, relating to several of the periods, as let's say these large periods as just shown in the bar graph. So both Bronze Age and classical, or Roman and medieval and Bronze Age, or things like that. And if we take the western branch of the survey, you can see all the red crosses here are such sites, which represent at least 3 periods. This obviously doesn't mean that the periods are continuous, or even that within these periods occupation was continuous, but it does seem to show that in many cases people came back to the same places at different moments in time, and perhaps continuously, perhaps not. I think in many cases we, on the basis of our survey data, we simply can't say. And this may not seem that spectacular in the sense that it's very usual in the landscape that places which are very well defendable or have water sources or are attractive in some way have recurring human presence. But the strange thing is that in our area, this multi-period phenomenon doesn't seem to be linked only to places of that kind. And I have a few examples of that. Sites 99, 15, and 46, I think, which are examples of this phenomenon, which we see in other places as well. And this is 1996-15, the revisit collection, but the original collection actually is not that different, which shows 2 stone axes, so Neolithic, perhaps Bronze Age, a volcanic grinder, some classical Hellenistic black clay pottery. There is a Roman shirt, which I don't recognize from the slide, and there is some medieval material. So actually here we have 4 different periods in 10 items. And this is a completely random hilltop in a hilly landscape. There doesn't seem to be any reason why this place would attract people over time. And before you ask that, these are, of course, are only 10 items. Why is this a site? There is more on the ground, but not that much more. But if you would walk 20 meters out from the core of the site to any site, you could walk for 100 meters and not find a single shirt or single item. So this is clearly a concentration of material, a concentration on a hilltop. Shirts don't walk up. So this must have been left behind by people over time in an area where they don't tend to leave behind lots of material otherwise. So a site. There's of course, a lot of discussion about what sites are and how to define them. But let's say, without going into that, that seems, well, quite certain here. Also because this one is not unique. If we go a bit further to 1996-46, that's a somewhat larger collection. It has ancient Greek, classical, Hellenistic, archaic even shirts, tiles. It also has Roman material and some Ottoman material. So, and again, this is a random bit of hilltop, of ridge. And yeah, so there are about 10, 15 of those in the northern, in the western section, and some and a similar number in the southeastern section. So that there clearly is a phenomenon which, well, is not easy to interpret, but it does seem to be a pattern. Not all these multi-period sites are random shirt scatters on hilltops. It's a phenomenon which also goes for more impressive, more visible places. And the typical situation of those is that they are hilltops again, but in this case fortified with 4th, 3rd century BCE massive fortifications. In fact, these sites have been studied and have been interpreted as fortresses related to the Hellenistic kingdoms and guarding the Author's borders or things like that. But actually, when you look at the material, these sites have a much longer life than just Hellenistic fortress. They usually have older material, sometimes Bronze Age, often archaic, classical, and they also have later material. They are reused or survive into the Roman period and later. So regarding these, as has often been done as Hellenistic forts, misses what they really are, although for a while they may have been, but they're clearly also, considering the number of sherds and the densities, they are clearly habitation sites which have been fortified only at a later stage. And there is a series of those. Some of those classified and studied before as Hellenistic forts, some of those classified and studied before as prehistoric sites, and some have never seen in this context before and were discovered as such or are interpreted as such in our survey. And I've also included old Havels here. I'll come back to that later because actually that is a bit of an outlier, but an important one. So if we now zoom in a bit on those hilltop sites, I have listed a few. This is another map of the southern ones. And these, the two, the Katok Senyas and the Magula Surpi one, have always been seen as prehistoric, mainly Bronze Age sites, but I will show you it's a bit more complicated than that. Magula Surpi looks like the classical tell site, a rounded hill growing above the landscape with a flat top. And full of pottery, but also stone remains. And much of the pottery on surface dates to the Bronze Age. So that's also how it has always been seen as one of the Bronze Age tells, as there are so many in Thessaly, also Neolithic ones, but this doesn't seem to have such old material, not much of it. And it has, if you look closer, Middle Bronze Age material, a lot of material which is not very well datable and is let's say typologically middle Bronze Age, but may well actually be much later. There is no diagnostic Mycenaean material. That's also typical for this area. We have a lot of material which goes from Middle Bronze Age into Late Bronze Age. It's a phenomenon which is visible in much of Central Greece, but it doesn't necessarily go together with diagnostic Late Bronze Age material. And one of the questions is, how to date such sites. But this is not only, and that's in the story of today more important, it's not only a Bronze Age site. There is also tile and fine wares, classical and Hellenistic pottery, perhaps some Roman. Tiles are very difficult to date in our area. And showing that this site has a longer life than just being a prehistoric tell. Actually, when you look at it closer, it has some features which are not very typical of prehistoric tells. On the northwestern part of the site, bedrock surfaces, and this is not completely a tell. There is a natural hill inside of it, and the prehistoric site was built or built up against a natural feature. But what this aerial photograph, which we actually made a few years after we surveyed the site, shows is that there are clear traces of a wall and perhaps even two ring walls surrounding the one surrounding the top. So there's an elevation around the orange bit of the picture, but there is also walling a bit lower down, especially on the right side, in the green bit. And those walls are not visible really when you walk the fields. There are a few parts of the lower one seem to be modern terracing, but that's only part of it, and part of it is simply not visible and seems to be older. And looting since this photograph has been made has shown indeed that there are walls in these places which are visible as ridges in this picture. So this is a walled hilltop, which could well be prehistoric. It's not wouldn't be unique, but it's not the typical tell site. And for the moment, we haven't been able to date any of the walling, partly because much of it is still buried, and partly because we need to go back and look in more detail at the looted holes. So that's one prehistoric tell, which turns out to be a fortified hilltop site. And there is another one, not a tell, but a previously known Bronze Age site, which was discovered in the 1980s when a new monastery was built and dug into a hilltop, which turned out to be full of archaeological material. And while the building wasn't stopped, there was some rescue work done at the time, showing lots of prehistoric material. This is a view on this 1980s monastery, which was dug into about a third of the site. And it also shows that this is a much higher hilltop than the previous one, with a very nice view towards the sea, but also towards inland. You can't see actually the Magula Surpi from this place, but you can see many other things. And even now, because of the digging in the 1980s, there's a lot of archaeology very close to surface, even deposits with bones, probably in the Middle Bronze Age layer, and substantial amounts of pottery surface, especially where digging has taken place. What you see on the right is basically a cut with bedrock on the bottom and then 2, 3, 4 meters of archaeological deposit on top. So it's kind of a tell on top of a rocky hill. Besides the monastery, already earlier in the 1960s or 70s, a road was dug into the side of the hill, and this exposed a nice stratigraphy. On the left, you see myself on top, to be, I'm afraid. But below that, there are 4 layers of what look like simple housing. And below the lowest level, in the bedrock, you see a small cyst grave. And this is an example of what seems to be a Middle Bronze Age tradition, where children are sometimes buried inside houses in these small cysts. But layers above, when you pick out the pottery, seem to be 2 Bronze Age layers and 2 classical and Hellenistic layers. So again, not just a Bronze Age site, even though there is some very nice, this is, I think, late, and it's not my specialism, but late Middle Bronze, early Late Bronze. This is by far the nicest shirt, I must say, but there is material partly also similar to that in the Magula Surpi, but partly also earlier and later. The rescue excavation publication, for example, shows these nice pots. But the publication is a bit strange because it was done by the prehistoric effort at the time, or the prehistoric section. But reading the publication, which is not easy to find, it turns out that they also found much later material, not only late Bronze Age up to late Hellenic 3C, but also early Iron Age. In fact, there is a megalithic wall which is dated in the publication to the early Iron Age or Archaic period, which sounds a bit strange on a site with Mycenaean. And there is clearly also later material, although the publication is a bit vague. But in our survey, it's very clear that there's a substantial amount of Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic material in the higher levels where the cuts are, in some parts of the site at least. And there are also traces of one of those 4th, 3rd century fortification walls. So the core of the site in the 4th or 3rd century became a fortress similar to the one shown before. So again, a nice case of something which is far more long-living than it initially seems. This brings me to a site which doesn't belong in the fortified hilltop categories. It's a site where the University of Amsterdam and the University of Thessaly and Erfurt are excavating now, which is probably the classical and earlier polis center, if it was a polis, of Halos. It's Magula Plataniotiki, so it is a tell site, but so far we haven't encountered any traces of prehistoric strata, but that may be a result of the fact that they could be very deep. This is a very marshy coastal area with a tell coming out of an area, which may have been a lagoon for much of antiquity. We excavate the north part of the tell, and even leaving aside our excavation aerial photographs and also geophysical research by Apostolos Saris, who is also in the audience today, has shown that this is a densely inhabited classical and Hellenistic town. It's about 7 or 8 hectares of inhabited area, and probably it goes back to the early Iron Age if we look at residual material. But there are very small quantities of prehistoric pottery, but it's doubtful whether there actually is a prehistoric site below this material. There is Roman material, there is medieval material, so this is again, technically speaking, a multi-period site. And it may have been fortified. It is, as you can see on the photographs, very clearly defined on the north and western sides. Although we have, even in testing, we haven't encountered any fortification wall yet. Also not in the geophysics. This is an image of the ongoing excavation of an area belonging to the 4th century. But, well, we are about a meter deep now and have reached from 346 probably up to the late 5th century. And there are 3 or 4 meters of archaeological deposit at least here. So it's cannot completely be excluded that we go beyond the early Iron Age, but we'll have to see. Geophysics does show structures that deep, but to date, geophysics finds is a bit difficult, of course. But here again, the site is not just a site, but part of a landscape. To its west is this early Iron Age burial zone, which is one of the largest in Greece. It's about 2 by 2 kilometers, has burial mounds, but also loose graves, several thousands of graves, which may belong with the Magula, but may also relate to other settlements. There are some traces of houses spread to the south of the burial area on the place of the other major feature of this area, the Hellenistic city, which you can see by the, well, part of it by the outlined lines and the image of the city wall. So this is probably the political social core area of the region, but the Hellenistic 50-hectare city has a rather small and ephemeral, maybe ephemeral is not the right word, but it has this tell in the middle of the marsh, which seems to have been inhabited for 3-4 centuries, perhaps a bit more. But much of the early Iron Age burial area may be older than that. So we'll have to see, and hopefully are able to see, how all these things fit together. One surprising result of the excavation is also that it seems that the Magula site kept being in use when the big Hellenistic city was built. There is a major Hellenistic phase also. So even though they did build a big new city, the old city wasn't completely abandoned. No. So that brings us back to this question: how to interpret this area in a wider context. So the size of the squares with the cities like Halos and Thebes and Pauma are related to their surface. So Halos and Melitea are the biggest towns, but this is Halos in its early 3rd century form, which only existed for 30 years. If we would take the Plataniotiki Magula site, it would be a square of the type of Arthakion or Thaumakoi or Eretria, so one of the smaller settlements of the area. And then we have these the tiny squares with the 2 with the arrows are 2 other hilltop forts in our survey, which have been seen as Hellenistic fortifications, but are again examples of sites with a much longer life. So these now also need some attention. We have two of them still not seen before in my talk today. One of them is a site now called Dios Nikolaos, with, again, fortifications, again, archaic, classical, Hellenistic, Roman, and some modern pottery. Fortification has been drawn in the 1990s, and it's quite impressive, but the site actually is somewhat bigger than the fortified area and certainly older than the walling. And then there's another one of those, the Castro near the modern village of Vrinena, which is the largest of these fortified hilltop sites. It's also the most isolated. It's quite far inland and not easy to spot and to go to. And it's, while the others are between 1/2 and 1 hectare, at least the walled area, the sites themselves are a bit bigger sometimes. This one is about 3 hectares. But for now, this site, which seems to go on in the 2nd and 1st century BCE, there's also some graves with it, seems to be the largest habitation center of the area in the 2nd century BCE, when the Plataneotike Magula site seems to be mostly abandoned. So, yeah, it's obviously not automatically that the largest site in an area is the polis center, but if this was the longest surviving relatively big place, this is quite surprisingly small. But yeah, the social circumstances or political circumstances may have made this necessary. Going back to the total overview, these are the sites, the fortified hilltop sites, plus the Magula Plataneotiki here labeled as Old Halos, which I've discussed now. And you can see some of them have prehistoric roots, some of them don't, although perhaps further research may show that as well. And they're quite evenly spread around the landscape. All except for Magula Plataneotiki are well defendable hilltop areas, and yeah, they seem typically they all have water nearby, so they're typically well defended, nice places to live, although some are quite isolated. And what they share is that they seem to have been in use for long periods, very long periods in some cases. And they seem to form some kind of framework in the use of the landscape, which is more stable even than the sites below and around them, even though some of those also, as seen before, can have habitation phases for long periods, at least as far as we can see. So this begs the question what Halos actually was. Was it indeed a classical, typical polis with a strong center and nothing around it? That doesn't seem to fit the way the landscape or the habitation in the landscape was organized. It seems to be perhaps a more tribal or a more evenly divided area, although it is possible or even likely that for much of the time the Magula Plataneotiki site was its political and also religious, there's texts suggesting that, and inscriptions, religious center. But if the Magula Plataneotiki site was indeed ancient Halos, it was not a big, relatively big city for most of the time. It was more of a primus inter pares, slightly bigger, slightly more important site in a landscape which had several smaller sites which were much older and show an equal kind or even more continuity. And well, this obviously this equality or between sites is something to consider. Also, the long, although not necessarily uninterrupted, life of not only these hilltop sites, but also many of the smaller sites. It looks like a very stably used landscape where people stayed more or less in the same places or returned to the same places over long periods. They need not have been on all these places all the time. In fact, it's very unlikely they were. But in some of the places, they indeed did live for long periods. And other places were clearly somehow recognized, remembered, reused, perhaps looted and therefore reused. But there is a skeleton, a framework of long used spots in the landscape, which seem to have carried society or have been a part of society for a very long time, and may have supported communities for very long periods. And well, this is a kind of long living landscape, which is difficult to connect to historical data, not only, let's say, more theoretical data regarding what is a polis. Obviously, one of the definitions of a polis is that there shouldn't be any major minor centers. Some minor centers are okay, but minor centers which are bigger than the main center or almost as big, that doesn't seem to fit the usual definitions. And certainly a polis which is in some ways, although perhaps not politically, polycentric, doesn't fit any regular definition. Of course, we could say the Halos wasn't a polis, but then we run into problems in the sense that there are inscriptions where Halos does behave and pretends to be a polis, and also some historians treat it as such. So there is a tension there between definitions, data, and what we see on the ground, but it's also data actually. And this requires some thinking in combination, I think, with the multi-period and long life of certain sites. So here again, can we imagine that we have something presenting itself as a polis, while at the same time consisting of 6, 7, 1 hectare, 2 hectare, 3 hectare sites and 1 7 hectare sites? I would consider it, but of course there's problems to it. And well, some of the problems are obvious. We cannot really prove, certainly not with the pottery we have, that all these places are always synchronous. Even something dated as classical Hellenistic may not have the same life moments as another place, also called classical Hellenistic. And our pottery is so badly datable that the deciding in such periods is often impossible. It's easy to think of continuity when you have Bronze Age, Archaic, and Roman in a single site. But of course, it's also possible that there are long interruptions in between those periods. But even if there are interruptions, the question is, why would people come back to these places? To some places, it's perhaps obvious if there's a nicely defendable hilltop with water, if there is a fortification which may have been reused after it was originally built. But there are many places where there's no, to us at least, no obvious reason why people would have come back. Perhaps memory or visible remains may have played a part. But then that comes back to the question of continuity. Maybe then people perceived some kind of continuity or some kind of connection to old bits in the landscape. And then the question, of course, is how does the polis and non-polis society come into this picture? Are we simply seeing a reflection of a non-city-state organization which adapts itself or pretends to be a polis? Or are we seeing an alternative form which should be treated and discussed and seen as a polis, but not one like the ones we are used to and that fit our standard definitions? Of course, this is partly a paper discussion, but I would suggest that thinking about this may help us understand this kind of society and this kind of landscape better. And of course, the question which I completely avoided in my talk, but is also still important, is that there are serious issues with our survey results, in the sense that the surface remains in areas like this have a degree or a lack of diagnosticity, which makes some of the conclusions quite tentative, and which one could argue would be an argument to actually start excavating some of those sites. But on the other hand, excavations which are happening in Magula Platiniotiki, on Katoxenias hilltop, show that they don't always necessarily change the survey picture very much, and that some of the issues discussed here would remain if you would excavate the places and find the kind of things we're now finding. Saying things about hierarchy of sites, establishing sites, datings and site continuity is not that easily solved with many excavations, at least if you're not finding certain very rare things. So yeah, I would say that the image as coming out of our survey is interesting and well-based enough to use as a starting point for thinking, even keeping into account all the issues and problems which I highlighted. And we will certainly do we are already doing more detailed study of the pottery to further underpin some of our conclusions and also illustrate and support them. So in that sense, we will make our survey results as reliable as possible. That brings me to my last slide. All this work presented here wouldn't have been possible without the contribution of very many students in the excavation, in our surveys, hardworking, but also having fun during the weekend and during dinners. And I hope some of them are here, and I want to, even if they're not, I want to thank them for their contribution. That was my talk. So we'll go out of the sharing, and I think we'll have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Stissi, for this very interesting and inspiring presentation. Your title was very promising, and I think you did what you promised to do. So
Okay.
going from shards and dots and maps to people and society, which it sounds self-evident, but it's not always. I know we're supposed to do this, but we do not always do this. So it was very important, and you showed how many thoughts can one have on the basis of a few shards, only in some cases, if you combine all the evidence. I found the notion of this alternative form of a polis particularly interesting and inspiring for other regions as well, not just Thessaly, but other regions, because we tend to see polis as one thing from the earliest Iron Age to the Hellenistic times, and from Thessaly to Crete, which is obviously not the case.
Mm-hmm.
So very interesting thoughts. Thank you very much for this.
You're welcome. Thank you for
and your sharing with your research with us.
Yeah.
And now is the time for questions or comments. So who would like to start? Anasis can help me with the chat if there are any questions there or comments.
There is people thanking our speaker for his interesting lecture, and congratulations, but no questions yet, Jorgo.
Yeah, you can either, Rania has, you can either raise your hand, you know how to do it, we all learned how to do it in the past 3 years, or send your question via chat, but you can raise your hand and have the the floor is yours. Rania Kuka.
Yeah, thank you, Yorgo, and thank you, Professor Stissi, very much for this, for your impressive research and your very careful interpretation. I mean, you have asked yourself how reliable are our survey results. The contra question would be how reliable are the historical sources. We should check the historical sources through the surveys and the excavations. I found very interesting your approach of having a polycentric polis there. And I would like to, and you have pointed that at Magula Platagnotiki, you may have had the political center. Based on the evidence, you could select the finds, the surface finds you had from the other potential centers, and relating these other small centers with the topography. Could you tell us if you would have other potential economic centers related with specific production of pottery or of sculptures or whatever? I don't know the landscape. That's why I'm asking you. Thank you.
This is a very valid and good question. We have done some research into pottery fabrics and regional or area differences within it, and we can partly actually locate some of the sources of the pottery. This shows that there's more than one production center in the area, and we can find some of these products in different sites. We haven't really mapped that yet, but this for the moment, the impression is that most of the larger sites have a mixture of pottery which comes from slightly further away in the area, but still within the area, and some pottery, but that's a bit more problematic, which we assume is produced closer to the sites. But our research is not so detailed yet, and may not be within the project we are doing now to be sure about this. What we can see is that all the inscriptions, and there are quite some inscriptions from the area, most of them are tombstones, but there are also some longer inscriptions. They seem to be concentrating very strongly on the Magula Platagnotiki area and its surroundings for the graves. So that does seem to be a confirmation of that being the political center. And there's simply nothing in the whole area which is there's no sculpture, but at least there may be some bits and pieces, but nothing monumental or bigger. And also, except for the fortifications, we have no traces, not even actually in Magula Platagnotiki, of monumental architecture. There are some loose architectural fragments from Magula, but that's about it. So that is, let's say, a lacuna in our research. Also, geophysics actually has shown some possible more monumental buildings on the Magula Platagnotiki, but they're not that clear. They don't jump out. But the general level of that kind of things may have been fairly low in the area, although it should be noted that we have quite early inscribed tombstones. I think some of them are archaic even, which for an area like this is quite surprising. So in that sense, something may be going on, but this is very much concentrated on Magula Platagnotiki. So that actually partly undermines my polycentric story. but that does seem to be the case. None of the fortifications, for example, seem to have monumental architecture, at least decorated monumental architecture, or inscriptions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanasis wants to ask something.
Yes, thank you, Yorgo. Thank you very much, Vladimir, for this thought-provoking presentation. It's not a question, it's more, it's raining really heavily here. It's more of a comment rather than a question. I mean, I found very interesting, as Urania also and Yorgos noted, your terminology and definition of a polycentric polis. I think, and the role of memory and visibility, of course, of past places. I mean, to me, I mean, working on a different period, obviously on a later period, and especially in a region both you and I have worked before in Boeotia, we see exactly the same pattern in the early Middle Ages, for example, when the big late Roman cities, towns are abandoned gradually, and a new settlement, a new nucleus is appearing in the neighborhood, in the vicinity, where you can, and those places acquire the status of the title of a bishopric. Now, if you look at those centers, I mean, you would imagine that in the Middle Ages, a bishopric is an important place. It's a central place. It is a local center. And when you look at it archaeologically in terms of the surface scatters, Koronia, for example, that you know very well, in the Middle Byzantine period, in the 12th century, it's listed as a bishopric, but archaeologically, it's no more than a hamlet or perhaps a farm. I mean, the quantity of the material and the quality of the material on the ground, whether that has to do with archaeological visibility is another matter, it makes it so unimportant to be a bishopric. So I was wondering whether, I mean, why not? I mean, is it really oh my God, I can't think of the word, but is it really the appearance of a place that makes it a polis in the classic and Hellenistic periods, or is it the status that it acquires in the the local perception, in the local organization, in the organization at the local level? Because I mean, as I said, in later periods, it's more of the second, right? It's the perception of the place, the status of a place, and the presence of some kind of authority. In this case, the ecclesiastical authority. So I found it very interesting, this comparison. To me, it was new.
Yeah.
I think.
No, I think that's a very good comparison. Two things come to mind here. One is that one claim to fame for Halos is that it's mentioned by Homer in the catalog of the ship catalog, which contains all the site references. And it may simply have been the mentioning of the place there, if that was, let's say, localized at Magula Plananeotiki, that may have been enough. A bit comparable to what you mentioned in the medieval period, it may have been enough to let that be the polis center, assuming what we are not entirely sure that actually was Halos, but well, the toponym also fits the place very well, so that may be likely. So, and that's, let's say, on one end. At the other end, there are two inscriptions which I think, one not found locally, but referring to Halos, and I think the other one is found locally, referring to Halos in the 2nd century BCE. And for the moment, there doesn't seem to be any substantial habitation on Magula Plananeotiki by that time. The site was more or less, maybe not completely, but it was largely abandoned by that time. But the inscriptions indicate that there still was a bule, and there were institutions representing Halos. And also, its mentioning by Roman authors indicate that as a civic entity, Halos remained in existence, even though we have barely any archaeology for that period. And that's also not unique in Greece. There's many places where you have that. But yeah, it does seem to indicate something along the lines you mentioned, that the status of a place and the history of a place may be stronger than its actual physical existence.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Yorgo, before I give the word back to you, there are no questions on chat. So I would like to take this chance to remind everyone, I'm sorry, Vladimir, I have to do this, of our lecture next week, Monday the 24th. It's actually by our Poppy, Kalliopi Sari, talking about textile technologies in Aegean prehistory, fabrics, tools, and sources. So we'll get back to prehistory for a short while next week. So that's by Kalliopi Sari. Thank you.
Please feel free to turn on your cameras and microphones to ask directly the speaker or comment. And while we're waiting for people to ask questions, may I ask one question related to the polis again that you discussed previously? May I ask you, you referred to inscriptions showing that Alos was behaving like a polis. You already mentioned an inscription of the 2nd century mentioning the bulla, but are there any other inscriptions mentioning this polis, let us say, structure other than that? And what?
No, there are two, and then there is I must now remember correctly. There's one from Delphi. There's this one from Halos. There's one of those is about a dispute with the bordering area.
Okay.
And then we have historical texts mentioning the city. Demosthenes went to Halos when it was besieged by Parmenion, and well, in that context, is also described as a normal city-state-like place. So, but that's not an inscription. And there are a few more. One recently found, but recently it has already been published. I think that has a list of persons on it. Ephebae or something like that. So that's also, well, that doesn't directly indicate the presence of political structures, but it implies it.
Yeah, so the earliest then is from the 4th century then, and it's the historical, the sources, the written sources, and then you have later Hellenistic inscriptions, but not anything earlier than that.
No, and Homer, but and there is a long text by Herodotus, but that's a completely different kind of text, where it is described that Xerxes comes to the area. That's after Homer, the second claim to fame, and there is a sanctuary there, and there is a taboo on it, and Xerxes respects the taboo and doesn't go into the sanctuary.
Okay.
And well, obviously that's a very suspicious story, which can be interpreted in various ways, but it does seem that there was this major sanctuary, and that the place was also, let's say, important enough to be mentioned by Herodotus.
The reason I'm asking this is because you mentioned in the beginning of your lecture the traditional idea that there is always this differentiation between the polis system and the ethnos system. So Italy is supposed to be the prime example of an ethnos structure where there is no single city-state being different than any other. So there is this substructure of smaller sites. So I wonder if you can tell from your evidence, I know this is a very difficult question to answer without excavating more, but if you can say that maybe in earlier times there was these ethnostructures there, and later, perhaps in the Hellenistic period, which is strange because then the city-state system is collapsing slowly, gradually. So if you have there anything from your material, from your shards and the dots on the map to go to this issue, or is this too early now?
Yeah, well, what we have, the only thing which I think is maybe relevant is this huge burial area, because that's concentrated. It's a single area, you can discuss a bit about whether it indeed is a single area or whether there are concentrations within the area. But it is all the early Iron Age graves we know from this area are in that area, and yeah, that seems to suggest some kind of central, at least some kind of central burial place. It's partly very visible because they're burial mounds, about 40 of them, and they concentrate in one area. And we know further north in Thessaly, for example, that you have smaller concentrations of these burial mounds and more spread out. Sometimes the concentrations are a few kilometers from each other, but here we have this area. Yeah, it's about 2 by 2 kilometers, which has the burial mounds, and then the area may actually be bigger because some of the graves are very deep down and have only been found because of the highway construction. And yeah, they are. There is a bit of extrapolation involved, but there's several thousands of graves, which for early Iron Age Greece is really a lot. So yeah, that's a concentration.
Good. Thank you. Very interesting. Are there any other questions or comments from our audience? I cannot see
voices, but not
chat.
No,
Other
no.
than congratulations and
well, thank you all for attending.
Yep. Okay. In which case, I think we can conclude our gathering now. Yorgo, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vladimir, for accepting our invitation. And it was wonderful to see you again, although not in physical presence. Still, thank you very much for sharing with us everything you've been doing in the region. And thank you everyone for your presence tonight. You may switch on your cameras always to, if you wish to say goodbye to Vladimir, and we hope to see you again next week for our lecture on textile technologies by Calliope Sari.
thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.